If you're a yoga practitioner, odds are you practice Warrior One. And if you practice Warrior One, I guarantee you hear the cue, square your hips. In fact, you've heard it countless times. If you're a yoga teacher like me, you've probably used the phrase thousands of times. But let's pause and let's ask ourselves a question. Is it necessary to square the hips in Warrior One? The quick, simple answer is no. It is not necessary to square our hips in Warrior One. Doing so is not more biomechanically sound, it's not safer, and it's not more efficient. Now, that being said, it's not a completely unfounded, erroneous cue, but it is a little bit misleading, enough misleading, in fact, that it causes a lot of challenges for people and can even have us sacrifice other elements of the pose and create lower back strain and sacroiliac discomfort. So how did we get into the situation where everyone thinks their hips need to be square? Why don't their hips need to be square? And what, as practitioners and teachers, can we do in this pose that's a little more effective, a little bit more efficient, a little bit more updated? Before I answer those questions, I want to say this. If your teacher says square your hips, or you're a teacher and you say square your hips, I'm not criticizing you, I'm not criticizing them. I've given this cue thousands of times, maybe 10,000 times. But as a teacher, we continue to grow, we continue to learn, we continue to refine both our knowledge, our skill set, and our communication. And that's actually where the majority of the focus is going to be in this conversation, is the communication of squaring the hips, because there's something that's off in the messaging here. So you see, when I tell you to square your hips, how am I using the word square? I'm using it as a verb. I'm using it as the action item. I'm telling you to do the squaring, right? But how do you hear it? You hear it as they should be square. I'm telling you square your hips as an action, but you're internalizing that the end result needs to be completely or perfectly square. And this might sound semantic, everybody, but in a way, I'm just gonna say it, the language of square your hips is being used a little bit lazy here, because it is a very identifiable word. When anybody hears square your hips as the action item, they're gonna internalize that the outcome needs to be perfectly square. And that's erroneous, and that can cause a lot of trouble. In order to get the hips truly square, you're gonna have to take a ridiculously short stride. When you sacrifice the length of the stride for this arbitrary, overly literal outcome, the feet are gonna be really close together, which means the back thigh, the back quadriceps, hip flexors, and adductors probably aren't gonna get that much of a stretch in the pose. And also, because the stride is so short, your front leg isn't gonna get much of an opportunity to work. You're not gonna get much of that isometric strengthening in the front leg and hip. Now, that's not necessarily bad or injurious, but it is an unnecessary sacrifice for this arbitrary gain of having the hips be square in the first place. The second thing, which is much more of a problem in my mind, is that if you do take this big full stride in Warrior One that gives you so many of the strength and stability benefits of the pose, but you're insistent on getting the hips square, they're not going to be square, which means you're always gonna feel a little unresolved. You're always gonna feel a little unrequited. You're always gonna feel like you're not quite doing it right, or your students are gonna feel like they're not quite doing it right. And honestly, that's no way to live. But even more so, this is a place where a lot of times people force the hips. They're rotating the pelvis forward till it stops, but they're continuing to try to turn. They're trying to square. But when you're putting a lot of rotational torque into the hips, and the hips are no longer moving because they've hit a point of maximum motion in a shape, then you're driving a lot of stress into the sacroiliac joint and into the lower back. So when you're applying stress to a body part and that body part can't move to absorb the stress, not only is it an inefficient expenditure, but that's one of the main places we start to be at risk for overuse, overwork, overstress injuries. So what do I suggest instead? Turn. I know it sounds boring. Turn your hips forward. Rotate your hips forward. Turn your hips towards the front leg. Rotate your hips towards the front leg with the claws until they stop. Everybody hear this differently, okay? Square your hips versus rotate your hips forward until they stop. Until they stop gives a very clear indication that when something stops moving, in this situation, your hips, stop applying a stress vector to them. Stop applying stress to them. If we do this one thing, stop pushing on a body part when it stops moving, we're going to save ourselves a lot of wear and tear on our body. And even more so, or not more so, but equally so, we're going to have a healthier relationship to our practice. We're going to have a healthier relationship to our body. So let me break down the pose for you in the most functional, modern, and practical way without, in my experience, losing the essence. First, my preference is not to keep the heels in the same plane as each other. That's not wrong or bad, but my preference for most students is to actually have their feet hip width apart. Now, if you have very narrow hips and very mobile hips, feet in the same plane or front heel bisecting the back heel is gonna work perfectly. That's totally fine, that's legit, that's not wrong. But if you have broader hips, or your students have broader hips, or you don't have quite as much mobility and strength in your hips, taking a slightly broader hip width apart stride is a more stable base, and therefore you can generate more mobility of your hips on top of that base. Second, I like to turn the back foot in at about a 45-degree angle. This is something that you can experiment with, but 45-degree angle is a good, important start. So we have our base of feet hip width apart, back foot turned in about 45 degrees. This is how I like to have people find their stride. There are 3 steps. First, when people bend the front knee, I want the front knee to be directly over the front heel or ankle joint, front shin vertical. Second, I want the pelvis to be level, meaning one hip is not up, one hip's not down, but also the pelvis is not anteriorly tilted or posteriorly tilted. A simple way of thinking about this is that your hip points, the bony knobs on the front rim of the pelvis, are level to the horizon line. Then the third thing is I want the back leg to be far enough away from the front leg, or the back foot to be far enough away from the front foot that you can keep the front shin vertical, that you can keep the pelvis level, and that you have a big enough stride that the pose feels like a good, sustainable challenge. So we have our width, we have our angle of the back foot, we have our distance between our legs, and now what are we doing with the pelvis? We're rotating the hips forward till they stop. That's it. Like literally, that's it. We're turning the hips forward till they stop. And when we have that mindset, we're no longer going to be continuously searching for something that is most likely not going to be there. What that gives us, everybody, is the freedom to work elsewhere. Then at that point, we can focus a little bit more on the spine, the chest, the arms, the shoulder. We're not hung up on this overly attached literal quality or sense of squared hips. So now quickly, before we part, all the YouTube things. Please subscribe, please like, please share, all of those things. Those are helpful to me. And even more important, as a practitioner and teacher, be willing to question and think through the why we do what we do part of the equation. And I know sometimes it can be overwhelming to do so, and there's so much information out there, But in a scenario like this, where we just take a step back and we ask ourselves, this thing that I say all of the time, where does it come from? Is it really important? And is it the message that I'm trying to convey? Those are important questions as practitioners and teachers to continue to reflect on. And finally, we need to reflect on them in a way where we don't have shame when we come up to, no, I think I need to make a change. I will tell you again, if you have not been a student of mine for decades or years, you might not have seen it, but if you have, I upgrade all the time. I find it to be so liberating to know that I don't know everything all the time, that I'm willing to grow, to revise, to change, that I'm willing to take in information from other sources and aggregate it with my own. Ultimately, as a teacher, I see that as a responsibility and a joy of mine. So hopefully you take this information in the spirit that it's meant, which is to help us with critical thinking skills and help us support our students skillfully with their practice.